Caitlin, I love being in your garden. It is just how I thought it might be in a way, because you're so articulate in your writing. Obviously, you wrote your first book age 13. It was published at 16. You've got 2 columns a week in the Times, and you've had them for years and years and years. Longest columnist ever, probably.
Feels like it, definitely, yeah.
And when you write, you really get to the nub of the point, and you say it in such a funny way, and it's the same when you speak. And you crystallise what we've all been thinking and just think, oh, wow, she's right. And I always think of you as the nation's psychotherapist, because you take a problem like something we're all obsessed with, but no one's ever mentioned it to anyone, and you crystallise out why we're obsessed with it, and why it's so hilarious, and what you do about it, and it just makes it all float away.
Oh, thank you. Well, my favourite thing is if there's something that's secret or taboo or difficult to talk about, that's where I want to go, and I want to like shine a big light on it and run towards it, banging a pan with a spoon and go, this is what we need to talk about now. But to try and find a way to talk about it that doesn't make people feel awkward. And like my job is to start awkward conversations, that's what I think, and do it in such a way that like basically you can blame me for any conversation that you then go and have with a loved one. You can go, well, Caitlin's written this thing about how men won't go to the doctors. I don't know if I agree with her. What do you think? And then you can blame me for starting that conversation rather than having to start it yourself. That's my job.
And you do it with kindness, isn't it? There's no sort of animosity to other people in your columns, I always think. It's always sort of with love and kindness and to help people. So you come away, you've been amused, and you've definitely learned something. I learned about anal sex. I'd never known anything about anal sex before. I thought, wow, she's really enlightened me this morning. And my husband would never mention or talk about it. And he probably didn't know anything about it either. I don't know. But anyway.
This has worked out so well. This is perfect. I'm so glad I taught Bunny Guinness about anal sex. This is amazing. Well, we need to do like a quid pro quo thing. You need to teach me about gardening, because I've got so many questions when I look around the garden. And like, for instance, you know what this is, don't you? And like,
this is some weed, and I'm going to actually use my plant app, because I don't know which it is. I've seen it before.
Yeah.
It looks like a sort of willow herb, but I don't think it is a willow herb.
It reminds me of willow herb. We used to have willow herb in our garden.
The red one?
Yes.
Yes.
And it just popped up on its own. But I just think it looks like some kind of paisley design. Like you'd see that on like a kind of pashmina or something. I just think it looks so psychedelic. So I was like, oh, if you want to grow there, you're very welcome. You'd be my guest.
So I use, Picture This is the plant app I've got. And I think it might be an epilobium, which is the willow herb. And I think it might be one of those. But I'll check it when we finish, because we're using the phone at the moment to film you. But when I see this garden, it is very Caitlin, isn't it? Because it's all pulled together and you've made sense of the space. And I think most gardeners who don't do it for a living, they find it very difficult to get a theme running through the garden and it to be pulled together and it to have character and oomph. But you've taken this wonderful kitchen, which you've done in this beautiful sort of slaty blue colour, and you've pulled the colour outside on the trellis, on the furniture, on the raised beds. And that's what helps pull it together. And then you wound the water coming through. So it tips down the waterfall and runs down the rill. And so it feels so tranquil.
Oh, thank you. Well, I wanted it to be really curvy. I just sort of like, initially it was supposed to be quite Alice in Wonderland-y. I wanted things to be sort of dominating you and for you to feel quite small when you came in and just have these curves that you're not expecting. Like, to feel surprised, like kind of you walk into the garden and like, hopefully you weren't expecting this and I've surprised you.
No, not at all. And the way it works with the interior, isn't it? It just really is the indoor-outdoor space. And also, you've done that other trick, haven't you? I don't know where it ends from here, but there is a pretty little hut at the end, and then there's a lovely outdoor eating area at the other end, or sofa. So you've got the morning sun here, and the evening sun.
The idea of the bit at the back is that's the place where all the secrets are told. So if someone comes round and we're in the kitchen and talking, if someone's got something secret they want to talk about, I'm like, let's go to the bottom of the garden and we'll go and talk about the secrets of the bottom of the garden where no one can find us. I think you want to have a place in a garden where you can just like gossip basically without worrying that someone's going to hear you in the house.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because coming from any family, you have to have your private spaces, don't you?
Yes.
Really, where you can talk freely and things like that. But this space, just sitting in here in the winter must be lovely, looking on all of this.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, I just sit here. Once we got the garden and the kitchen all sorted out, I just realised that I wasn't watching television anymore, because I would just sit here and watch the garden. And one of the things that I wanted to do, I'd got very sad, as I think a lot of people do, about kind of like, environmental degradation and kind of the loss of biodiversity. And for ages I was like, well, we're doomed, and so I'll just be depressed. And then I was like, well, no, I could make my garden different. I can make it so that I'm getting more living things in my garden. So I had a list of all the creatures that I wanted to have in the garden at the end of the year, and I read what you'd have to have in the garden to attract them. And it worked. For instance, I'd always wanted goldfinches. I think they're so beautiful. They're like Britain's parrots. They're so jolly.
Yes.
And we'd never had any. So I just read what they eat, and they want teasels and they want Niger seeds. And so I've got a Niger seed feeder there, and within 6 weeks of putting the pond in and putting the Niger seeds up, I had a pair of goldfinches that come in every day. And that now I just sit in the kitchen and watch them, and I'm like, I had a problem, it made me feel sad, I found out what the solution is, and now I can sit here and enjoy my birds. And that for me is the thrill of having a garden. It's like your little kingdom, and whatever your sadnesses are and whatever you need from a garden, you can sit down and literally write a list, and 9 times out of 10 solve that problem and have a tiny little world that works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what is nice about the garden, so you sort of gave it a big overhaul recently, and you will never finish it, will you? You probably next year will think, well, I would like to have more big-eared bats or whatever,
Yes.
and so you'll do something like that. And you'll have another project, and you want a sauna eventually, maybe put that in or whatever.
Hedgehogs are my new one. I found there's a
Hedgehogs.
hedgehog conservation charity around here, and they find hedgehogs that have just been injured and they rehabilitate them, and then you can go and get a hedgehog and put them in the garden. So
Yeah.
I'm now rearranging the garden to make sure it's safe for hedgehogs, and by this time next year, hopefully I'll have a flock of hedgehogs just wandering around the garden. Yeah.
Snuffling around.
Because I remember them from my childhood, and
Yeah,
and I can't remember the last time I saw one. So I'm just like, okay, well, that thing that I want from my childhood, it's almost being able to time travel. I'm like, that thing that I loved from my childhood, I can make it happen here now if I do the right things.
So would Luna eat a hedgehog? Because I've known dogs to attack hedgehogs, because badgers apparently are a major enemy of
Yeah.
hedgehogs. But Luna wouldn't?
No, I mean, when we
Luna
got
wouldn't.
burgled last year, we just came downstairs and found her just wagging her tail at the burglars. So, she's a very friendly creature. She's also a coward. I mean, if as soon as something pricks her, she would run away. So I think we'll be all right there.
So when you're writing, so you're starting off your column, and maybe you're talking about, well, your recent one, the paperback with the man's problem. Men
Yes.
don't interact, don't solve problems enough. Tell me what you found out about men, because I found that fairly extraordinary too.
So I'd spent the last 10 years writing about women, and I got to a point where I realised that 50% of the problems that women have are men. It's like angry men, it's abusive men, it's men who can't communicate, men who might not be sort of pulling 50-50 in a relationship. And I was like, well, there's only so many books where you try and solve the problems of women, where you're just talking to women about women's problems, before you have to go, well, if I want to solve the other 50% of the problems, we need to start solving the problems of men. And when at the beginning, I was like, well, men don't have problems compared to women. Like, we still live in a patriarchy. Like, women are still having to deal with all this stuff. But when I started researching men, by the end, I felt quite heartbroken, because if you go into any bookshop in the world, there's a women's section talking about women's problems. There is no men's section, and we don't talk about men's problems. So just things like, my sister-in-law is a GP, and she was saying that whenever a patient comes into her clinic, if it's a woman, she says, "Why are you here?" And they will give her a list of the symptoms. If it's a man, he will say, "I'm here because my wife sent me." And they will have usually left it so long since they started having the onset of their symptoms, and they're terrified that they're now going to be given bad news. Whereas if they'd gone 3 or 4 years earlier, they would have caught it at the beginning. They wouldn't be scared. So it's like, why can't men help themselves? Why do men find it difficult to talk about their anxieties and their weaknesses and their problems? And so I just wanted to write a book examining why that was, and I found the answers. And it was when I was talking to teachers, they were saying that it starts at the age of 6. Before the age of 6, boys and girls are the same. They will all talk about their problems, their anxieties, they'll ask for help, they'll play games. And at the age of 6, that's where you start hearing, boys don't do that. Boys don't cry. Boys don't hold hands. Boys don't hug each other. Boys don't talk about their problems. Man up. And the teachers were saying that it's always usually the most screwed up kid in the class, a child that comes from an abusive background or has an absent parent or an abusive father. And so that's how we set the tone for conversations about men. The most screwed up men tell all the other men, you can't talk about this stuff, you can't have these conversations. Whereas women talk about everything.
Yeah.
If you're with another woman and you've both had children, within 30 seconds you will be talking about your difficult births, and you will be incredibly graphic and bonding about these things. But men would never sit down within 2 minutes of meeting each other and start talking about their prostate problems or their high blood pressure or their anxieties. And I just feel that in this case, women have got a better technology that we can share with men, which is the ability to make ourselves vulnerable to each other. And in making ourselves vulnerable, we just learn things and feel like we're together. And then we start working on solutions. And so I just wanted to write a book that was like, hey men, you could probably borrow a tip from women here. We seem to have found this brilliant technology called feminism that allows us to talk about all our problems. And it met with mixed reception. A lot of men were like, basically like, no, I'm going to man up. I'm not going to read your book about my problems.
I'm going to grow up her. Yeah, exactly. So really, it's the conditioning. It is purely conditioning, you think, really?
Of course.
Yeah, and we can get round that, through that.
Well, all the studies that you see, there's no real difference between men and women or boys and girls. It's literally just cultural. And if you look at the way that women have changed in the last 100 years, if you look at women 150 years ago, their lives are unrecognisable to us. Our great-great-grandmothers had no vote. They were the property of their fathers and then their husbands. You couldn't have a bank account. If you got married, you would then have to give up your job. You know, you could be, sent off to an insane asylum on the say-so of your husband. Like, we couldn't go into space, we couldn't rule a country, we couldn't do any of these things. 150 years later, our lives are absolutely unrecognisable. We've completely reinvented what women are for, and for the better. In that same 150 years, the idea of what men are hasn't really changed at all. They're not wearing top hats anymore, but apart from that, there hasn't been this kind of sense of like, how are we going to reinvent men? How are we going to reinvent humanity? And I just think, if you talk to so many men who talk about what makes them depressed and anxious, they don't seem to have realised you could rebel against the idea of what a man is now and become whatever you want. Who are you being this big, brave man for? If, when you look at the rates of suicide in this country or mental health for men, it's not working, so maybe it'd be time to try something different.
It's interesting because on Gardener's Question Time we always get, it used to be when I first started sort of 25 years ago, it was nearly always grey-haired women in the audience.
Yes.
Now the audience is much younger and we are getting many more men. But we still get the questions about, the man is out there with a cylinder burr mowing the lawn, pruning down the shrubs and things, and the woman wants it much freer and easier. And I think when I look at a garden, I can often tell whether it's designed by a man or a woman. So I do think there are definite traits between the two sexes, but maybe they're partially conditioning.
I had the same thing
know.
when I went to Hampton Court Palace a couple of months ago and I was looking at all the espaliers.
Yeah.
I think I could tell the ones that had been trained by men and the ones that had been trained by women. The ones that the men had done were just like so straight and like kind of like really, whereas the women had gone for more kind of curvy sort of shapes and stuff. And I guess that again comes down to the idea that there's one right way to do things. Like it's the way that you were taught to do these things. Men like to sort of carry on these traditions, whereas women are like, well, lots of traditions have not really worked out for women. Women are much more likely to rebel. I think women are much more likely to try something different. And I think, that's not innate in men. I think maybe they're scared to do it, whereas women have never had anything to lose because we were already losing. So it's, if a woman becomes a head gardener, that's still a rare thing. So it's already a revolutionary act. So she might as well just do everything in a different way. Whereas if you've got to maintain a tradition of being like the 700th male head gardener of a place, you'd be less likely to rock the boat.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So when you set about designing this, did you do it on paper or did you do it in your head?
When I first got this house 20 years ago, I just had a baby and I was completely insane. And I was convinced that the best way to design a garden would be to buy a canvas that was 8 feet wide by 4 feet tall, divide it into 4 and do an oil painting of the garden in each of the 4 seasons with all of the planting on it. And once I had completed the oil painting of all 4 seasons, then I would plant the garden. And I started doing this and my husband found me about 6 weeks into this at like 2 o'clock in the morning, just like painting all these tulips in for April and crying. And he's like, what are you doing? I was like, I want the garden to be nice. And he was like, well, why are you painting an oil painting? I was like, because this seems the only way that I could do a garden. And he was like, I think you might have postnatal depression. You might need to go to bed. It doesn't need to be this complicated. So I junked the oil painting. And then I would just come out and like potter. I just came out and just started digging. And it was the first time, if you want to change something in the house, you have to get builders in. If you want to do something big and structural to a house, you have to get men in and draw plans and get permission and all these kind of things. But if you go out in the garden with a spade, you can dig a border in 20 minutes and completely change the way that it looked. And I got so addicted to the fact that you could come out and do something. And then as I learnt things like, I'd seen this was when we went to Barcelona and looking at all the curvy architecture in the parks there. I came back from Barcelona, I was I want that in my garden. And then I'd seen somewhere there's the little pockets where I've got planting in the sides of the walls. And that was from seeing dry stone walls where like a stone's fallen out and things are coming out of them. And then my next plan for the pond is I went and stayed in a house where there was a huge ancient medieval well in the garden.
This one?
Yes.
Yes.
And down the well, it was all lined in slate tiles all the way down, and all these little ferns and mosses were growing out the side of it. So when you look down the well, it was like a tunnel of green. And I was like, that's the next job will be to build up the sides with some slate so I can have things growing out the side of it. So it's always going places and seeing something and going, I probably never will be able to go back to Barcelona again or stay in that house with the well. So I'll make it happen in my house. And then this way, whenever I go out in the garden, everywhere's reminding me of somewhere that I've been, and I can just travel the world just by walking around the garden.
So you've done it in little stages. You didn't put it all down on the plan. You just did it organically as you went on through.
Which is definitely the more expensive way to do it, because quite often they would build something and then a year later I'd be like, oh, knock it down. So for instance, this border here just stopped there, and then we had a patio here before, and then I had to get them to knock everything down and continue the curves around and stuff. So I've done it in the most impractical and expensive way it's possible to do it, but I kind of like going out and doing it bit by bit, because then you see what happens and what it looks like in the light, and you're like, oh, I know how to tweak that next year. So yeah, I probably should have done a plan. It would have saved me a lot of money, but I just like going having a little project every 6 months and changing something.
I do think the fun of the garden is you going on and developing it and altering it. You know, if it was done, it would be so boring.
Oh, it'd break my
you're
heart.
Breaking it on, you're taking it on the whole time.
Oh yeah, if I ever came out here and I couldn't see anything that I wanted to do, then I think we'd just have to sell up and move house the next day.
Like slit your throat,
right?
You?
Yeah, no. I love the fact there's always something to do. Like like yesterday I was skip diving, and I just found these bits of wood, and I was like, oh, I've got a chainsaw. I could cut these down, and I can use them to build like a little planter in the corner. And I was just out here at like 10 o'clock at night with a torch, just sawing these and making some little planters on the side. And like, that's part of the fun of it. Like, I didn't even know I was going to do it till I saw the wood, and I was like, oh, I can use that. And yeah.
But the design, that's actually quite Spanish, isn't it? That table and bench. That reminds me of Barcelona a bit, isn't it?
It's the same thing. So I designed all this when I was telling the builders what to do. They were like, well, we've never built one of these before, so we don't know what to do. So it's like a concrete bench, and then a table with a tree growing right through the centre of it.
So that tree is your crab apple, and it comes through a hole in the table like the parasols do.
Yes.
And you've actually got strings pulling branches back to the house. So you're going to train it like a big umbrella tree. And you're going to sit underneath Penny or Column in the shade.
So this is a combination of like sort of all the moulded concrete was what I saw in Barcelona, and then I saw this when we went to Japan, and we went around the gardens in Japan. They were training the trees with these strings, and there they do it really beautifully. They make sure there's a very beautiful rock tying each one of the strings down, whereas I've used a big tin of varnish to tie one of them down, which is slightly, not sure what they wouldn't be doing in Tokyo, but you know, I quite like bodging a job and seeing how it works out.
But I think why it works is because you're very consistent in your curves, aren't you? I mean, I always remember I did one when I was learning. I did one garden with sort of radius curves everywhere, and I mixed it in with the sort of gentle serpentine curves, and it doesn't work. But you've done your serpentine curves, haven't you? All of the same type, and so it does all pull together. And I like this little pool like there because it somehow in my head it's linked to that. I think it's all one. Obviously it's not. Oh, it is.
Yeah,
maybe
no, it is. They're all
they're
all linked up, and then the pump takes it all the way back to the top and down the waterfall again.
Yeah, and it's the noise, isn't it, in London to have all this greenery, really cool. It's been a really hot day today, and it really cools it down, and then you hear the water, and I can just see that it goes on and on and on almost forever.
Well, this was when I became menopausal. I like in my before I got a very good blend of HRT. I was so crazed with the lack of hormones that for 6 months I thought that we had to go and live in Wales and become completely self-sufficient, to the point where I was looking at how much it would cost to buy a forge so I could forge my own metalwork. I was like, if there's an apocalypse, we need to be ready to be self-sufficient. And then I got some really...
Forge is a very important part of
self-sufficiency. Right. I was like, I would literally be able to make my own...
To shoe your horse.
Farrows, yeah.
Yeah, as well,
and then I got some really good HRT, and I started to think that maybe society would remain stable enough for me to remain in London. But I still wanted to have that feeling that you get in Wales, where you always hear water, and there's always moss and stone. So this was my kind of like, okay, you don't need to move to Wales. You could get a lot of the things that you love about Wales in this garden, and then you don't need to move. So a combination of hard landscaping and HRT was very pivotal at that moment. And I would tell any woman who thinks that she needs to make a big life decision to just go and get her hormones checked first.
You have to be careful though, don't you? It's very difficult to get right. I'm sure people must write in and tell you that. And my sister has been trying all different potions for ages. But yes, I'm sure you're right.
Oh, it takes years to get the balance ready, and there's
Yeah.
like, and the colour that I painted the upstairs bathroom was at a point where I still hadn't quite got the balance right. It was quite a vivid orange, and then afterwards, once I got the right measurement, I was like, okay, yeah, that was hormones as well. So yeah, so there's
Orange. One client had a bright orange kitchen, and it was staggeringly good, actually.
Yes.
You could do so much with colour. Are you sure it was
oh,
hormones?
if it's the right one, this was way too much. It was like walking into a desert every day. I've toned it down to a nice mustard now. It definitely works better. But I think sometimes you think that you need to make a big life decision where all you need is a tiny bit of medication to just sit down for 5 minutes and just go, actually, this is going to be fine.
Well, I think we could do with someone like you on Gardener's Question Time, because we get, obviously, someone just comes out of the blue and asks you a question of what to do with whatever. And you would give such a funny, off-the-cuff, quick answer. You're as quick on your feet at speaking as you are at writing, which is pretty extraordinary.
I think they might get annoyed with it, because 9 times out of 10 when someone's got a problem, I'm like, but is it a problem though? Like if you sat there for 6 months, like maybe you'd like it? Because like a lot of the things that in the garden when plants came through initially, I was like, no, pull it up, I don't like it. And then I would just go, no, just wait, give it 6 months, let it vibe, as the young people say. Let it vibe, let it mellow,
yes.
and see how it comes up. And 9 times out of 10, actually, the garden does know what it's doing, and it just sort of like, it's actually trying to tell you something. It's going, actually, you do need some nettles here, because the certain caterpillars need to lay their eggs on this, and then you will enjoy the butterflies. So I've learnt to kind of just let the garden vibe a bit and just sort of let it tell me what it wants to do next. I mean, if you come back here next year and I'm just completely covered in brambles, trying to fight my way out, going, Bunny, I should have imposed more discipline on the garden. You'll know that I got it wrong. But.
Well, no, that will be another project, won't it, bringing it back, which is quite fun. I think the hack and slash.
Well, I think anyone who's read The Secret Garden when they were a kid loves the idea of just like walking through a door and just going, wow, with a mower and some clippers, I could bring this whole place back. So that would be fun.
Yes, very romantic. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's been fantastic. I particularly love your dahlias.
They're lovely, aren't they? Yeah.
And I love the way you've got your planting at high levels. I think that's partly the way you've played with your levels, why it's so successful, because it makes it all come in more, doesn't it? And it makes them more near eye level. And is that Johnson's Blue, that geranium? That
Roxanne, I think.
Oh, Roxanne.
Yeah.
It goes on. They're very closely related, aren't they? It goes on and on and on. And it's fantastic. And lots of containers, again, in similar shades, isn't it?
Yes.
Everywhere bird feeders.
Yes, no, I want the birds. Well, I read somewhere, I think the only piece of advice that I absorbed was just sort of try and limit it to 2 or 3 materials and colours, and then it'll probably cohere. So kind of like, so the idea was just like sort of everything's basically blue or purple. Yeah. All the curves are quite gentle. And yeah, I think that was the only rules really. Just make gentle curves and just make everything blue. And like with those 2 things, it looks like you know what you're doing, but I can assure you I don't.
It certainly looks as though you do. And I love your lights up on that pergola at the top end. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I've tried for years to try and find solar lights that work, but like I just have not been able to find any, so these ones are plumbed into the mains. But then 2 weeks later I read, if you have your lights on at night, you're going to confuse the bats and the moths. So they've a beautiful lighting system that literally lights the whole place up like Studio 54. It's a full-on disco, and I haven't turned them on since we plugged it in because I don't want to make a bat sad. So sometimes if I could email the bats and go, look, next week I'm having a party. Is it okay if I put the lights on? You just go somewhere else. That would be my preferred way of like telling them.
Yes. Oh, those poor bats. And there's such a shortage, aren't there now? Yeah.
Yeah.
But probably people don't realise with outdoor lighting, because everywhere, it's in every garden. But it confuses them, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Is that right? It upsets their circadian rhythm, I think.
Well, they're just drawn towards it, but like now there aren't any at all. Like we went to a gig a couple of weeks ago up on Hampstead Heath, and they got the big floodlights out to like sort of light the ways. And like even 10 years ago, there would have been clouds of moths around the lights, just kind of like going crazy. Not a single one. Like I find that quite scary, which is
So
like
nothing for the bats and the birds and everyone else.
No, they're like kind of like the sort of the bat conservation charities are saying they're having to feed the babies because they're just finding them on the floor starving. So that's like part of the reason why I've just tried to like let this go a bit wild. It's like kind of if any bats want to come by and have a snack, I want to be ready for them. Sometimes I see them going past and I'm like, can I text them and just tell them to come here? I've got insects.
Have you got one of those bat machines? And it's a sort of thing, and it listens and it picks up what bats are in the area and what types of bats
My
are. And
sister
it's a
told me
tiny
about
little
this.
thing.
Yeah.
And I was having dinner with someone who works in Burley Park, their chief forester there, and we had it on the table, and he was like, oh, that's a so-and-so, and that's a so-and-so. And it was amazing, actually, Because it's just helpful to know what you've got. You know, you are doing some good. I'm sure they're around somewhere.
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Knowing what you've got, like I've kept a species list of everything that I've had in the garden since I rewilded it, and I've now gone into my second column that's made me really happy. Just kind of like, because I sit there with my binocular waiting for them to come out, and that's just been really exciting having this list because there was nothing in this garden 2 years ago, and now I've got great spotted woodpeckers, chaffinches, dunnarts, goldfinch, broad-bodied chasers, speckled woods. Large whites, the jays, the long-tailed tits will come down. We had a mega flock last year. I'd never seen this before. It was in March, and I looked in the garden, and there was suddenly about 30 different species of birds that I'd never seen before. All just came down in one go as like a sort of crowd. It was like Live Aid. It was like sort of like celebrity after celebrity of the bird world coming down. They were here for about 2 years, and they went off. And then I went on Twitter and went, I've just seen like woodpeckers and dunnarts and chaffinches and goldfinches and long-tailed tits, a whole flock of them all together, and then for 2 hours, and they went, that's a mega flock. And like once a year, all the different species get together and move around in a group to see if there are new territories where new food sources have come along. I was like, well, why
So they spotted you?
Yeah.
Here we are.
They came and knew. I
arrived.
built it and they came. And I was like, well, why isn't that on the news that mega flocks are in the area and that if you get your food out, they'll come back and stay? I was like, this is what I want to see on the news now. Just kind of like people telling me if there's a lesser spotted woodpecker in the area and we can all alert.
Well, I'm waiting for your gardening book now, so that must come up your list, I think.
Yes.
Designing your or how you would do it for wildlife, for mental health, for everything. Yeah, we'd love it.
Yeah.
And you'd make us laugh. We'd learn how to get rid of the slugs if we wanted to, how to grow beautiful dahlias, how to lay out a garden, and how to enjoy yourself with a bit of humour.
Well, if Bonnie Guinness is telling me to write a gardening book, I guess I'd better write a gardening book, so thank you.
And then a garden at Chelsea the year after to launch it.
Why not?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you
been
so
great.
much, darling. Thank you.